As they gather for yet another summit, G20 leaders are urged to impose a tax on international financial transactions. Advocates of the Robin Hood tax say it will meet the costs of the economic crisis and support poor nations. But will G20 countries heed this call? And is the Robin Hood tax idea feasible? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abu Gaida. Well, banks should pay their fair share to clear up the mess they helped create. This is the proposal put forward by the Robin Hood tax campaign to the G20. Leaders have gathered for a two-day meeting in Seoul for the G20 summit. The group, which was formed in 1999, consists of the world's 19 leading economies, plus the European Union, and accounting for 85% of the world's economy. G20 leaders meet twice a year to discuss international trade and finance. Well, this year's two-day meeting is likely to focus on monetary policies and trade imbalances. Meanwhile, thousands of people are on the streets of the South Korean capital, Seoul, demanding that the leaders put people first. And in line with this is the Robin Hood tax campaign. Well, representing over 200 million people across the world, it calls on leaders to listen to their people rather than the banks. Supporters of this global tax say as governments around the world consider austerity measures, banks that were bailed out over the last 2 years are back to business as usual. And a Robin Hood tax would mean the world's banks pay to reduce deficits that they helped cause and remove the need for austerity measures, as well as supporting developing nations. Well, the Robin Hood tax campaign is in fact a global alliance in favor of an international financial transactions tax, which is also known as an FTT. The group wrote to the British Prime Minister David Cameron asking him to make concrete progress in Seoul towards the introduction of a global FTT. It also said that it would help meet the costs of the global financial and economic crisis, including reducing the unacceptably high rate of job losses and achieving key development, health, education, as well as climate change objectives in developing countries. Well, joining us now are our guests. We have in London Max Lawson. He's a senior policy advisor at Oxfam and is a spokesperson for the Robin Hood tax campaign. Also in London, Simon Hills. He's an executive director at the British Bankers Association. And we have joining us from Nairobi, Ali Khan Sachu. He's a financial analyst and is the CEO of Rich Investments. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us on Inside Story. Simon Hills in London, if I may begin with you. The Robin Hood tax on banks is set to raise billions to support developing nations and boost economic recovery. Do you oppose this campaign?
I think we all want to support economic recovery, and we all care about poverty in countries around the world. We all care about climate change. But let's remember, this financial transactions tax is not a tax on banks. It's a tax on financial transactions, foreign exchange transactions, derivative transactions, which are so important to oiling the wheels of world trade.
Max, coming to you now, the Robin Hood tax campaign slogan is, in fact, let's turn the crisis for the banks into an opportunity. How so?
Oh, we think there is a wonderful opportunity here for the banks to do the right thing, for the financial sector to pay the right level of taxation and to use that money for these vitally important causes. The financial crisis has cost hundreds of millions of lives around the world. This money could really help with that and also help with the fight against climate change. So it's a great idea whose time has come.
Ali Khan, do you agree with the Robin Hood tax? What's your reaction to this?
Well, I think philosophically it's feeding off a very strong emotion that a lot of people have, that ultimately taxpayers were the lenders of last resort to the banks, and the returns that they received were actually very poor returns, and that maybe the more unjust and fair way of going about things is a sort of insurance premium, that if the banks are going to come and rely on us again, that they should be paying some insurance. The example I would give of a return which was commensurate with being the lender of the last resort was the state of Qatar's investment in Barclays Bank, where they got a very handsome return and probably a just and fair one in the circumstances. So I understand those emotions, and I think they're very, very powerful indeed. And you know, the President Obama felt the backlash, I'm sure, of exactly that type of emotion. But the problem is the G20 right now is like herding cats. There is no coordination amongst them. It's every man, country, woman for themselves, and it's a game of a race to the bottom. And I think this proposal, whilst it makes sense and it's rational, really is a fairy tale proposal given the current landscape that we're watching play out in front of us right now.
All right, Max, Ali Khan, they're saying that it's a fairy tale proposal. So what do you think of people that doubt that this campaign can come to fruition?
I think 2 or 3 years ago it would have been a serious point, but I think the politics have changed. I completely agree that the G20 is in disarray and they're busy arguing over currency imbalances and the like. But we have seen progress on this issue politically, particularly in Europe. There's a very fruitful politics where, as you know, many European nations facing serious financial difficulty and deficits, and with the financial sector returning to enormous profits. So as a Robin Hood tax campaign, clearly we want to see a global agreement, but we're not stupid. We know that politically that could be a long way off. So that's why we think the Europeans could move ahead first. We know that the French president is very keen on this as a possibility. So we think there is real political space. And it's immensely popular. Let's not forget, politicians really need to reach out to voters on this one who are very, very angry about what's happened in the last few years.
Simon, do you think that banks even deserve to be taxed?
Well, banks want to pay the right level of tax, but let's remember this so-called Robin Hood tax is not about taxing banks. That's a political question. If we think banks should be taxed more, I don't, then they should be. But that is a decision to be taken by finance ministers. This financial taxation transaction tax is about taxing financial transactions that, as I said earlier on, are so important in the financing of world trade. Customers of banks will pay this tax. Banks themselves won't.
Okay, Max, over to you. Simon saying that this is not a tax on banks, it's a tax on financial transactions. You're behind this campaign. What do you say to that?
I think it's quite clear now. There's been significant studies of this proposal since we launched the campaign a year ago. The International Monetary Fund, a really serious player in all of this, has said that this tax would be progressive. Now, what that means, I mean, he's quite right that the tax isn't paid directly by banks, it's paid effectively by the customers of banks and hedge funds. But it's an immensely progressive tax. Effectively, it's a tax on capital, and the owners of capital are the richest people in society. So this would be, we're not suggesting that every single penny would be paid by the richest people, but the vast majority would be. And that has now been recognised by the IMF, by the European Commission. So if it's about making society more equal, from taking from some of the richest people in society, enabling them to pay a bit more tax to help the poorest, then this is a really good way of doing it.
Max, is there any way that any of these costs could actually be passed on to customers?
We think, as I said, it's a progressive tax. It will fall on some customers of the banks and of hedge funds, but let's be clear, the average customer for a hedge fund, their initial stake is $1 million, so they have to be very rich in the first place to engage in the kind of casino banking that we've seen in the last couple of years. But the key point here is that as a tax increase, it will fall predominantly on the richest segments of society, so it's a very progressive move which raises finance, which can then be used to help the poor at home in rich nations, the poorest people that are losing their jobs in the UK and Europe, but also critically to help the poorest people in Africa who are paying for this financial crisis with their lives. We've seen cuts in aid from some of the key nations, citing the financial crisis as a problem. We're running out of money for HIV/AIDS drugs in Africa. That's a death sentence for millions, a direct result of the financial crisis. So we think there's a clear logic here and a fairness, but that we think it's also technically feasible that the banks, the financial sector, and the richest people in society should pay a bit more through this tax.
Ali Khan, let me just go back to the G20 meetings that are actually taking place right now. Now, back in June of this year, we saw the global finance ministers, they were meeting in Busan in South Korea at that time, and they scrapped a plan for a global tax. So what's different this time? What will make the leaders meeting in Seoul right now take a look at this campaign, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's political pressure, and I think they've got to be cognizant of it, and that's a political calculation. They can't look at as if they're completely ignoring it. but they are hardly agreeing on anything. They can't agree on currency values. They can't agree on capital ratios that have to be applied to the banks. They're already relaxing the rules which were meant to be in place by this stage in time. And what you're going to find is banks are the most, are very, very powerful in the 21st century. They're very effective at lobbying, and they're very clever at running way ahead of the regulator and taking advantage of different countries' regulatory regimes. And so for now, I think this really is a pie in the sky. It's a lovely thought, and I think it's got serious momentum. But let's not be naive about it. It's going to be practically impossible, I think, to get everybody to agree to this tax together. I think that's the problem. We're living in an environment where people are not prepared to be herded together, and everybody's looking at their primary national interests. And when jobs are being lost at a terrific clip, all these ideas might sound very good, but they're not going to focus the minds of the decision makers right now, I don't think.
Simon, Ali Khan there saying that this is gaining momentum. Can you argue that this is now perhaps less relevant post-global financial crisis?
Well, I think that banks have played a big part in the financial crisis that we've seen, but not the only part. Let's think about lack of supervision. Let's think about poor monetary policy. All of those have come together, and perhaps the role that banks played has been in exacerbating that somewhat. But banks have raised more capital. They are holding more liquidity. They do not ever again want to turn to the taxpayer for funding. So I think that the banks are moving forward to put themselves in a more robust position, and they are paying society back. Banks are paying levies on their taxation. They are paying for the support by way of guarantee and so on that they were given to help them through this crisis. So banks are doing their bit already, in my view.
But looking at this particular tax, Simon, this Robin Hood tax, it's estimated that it could raise $400 billion. That's the figure a year to fight some of the issues that Max was talking to us about, poverty, climate change, among other things. So surely this is a good thing.
It's a good thing to fight poverty. It's a good thing to fight climate change. But those are political initiatives that we as a society have to decide how we want to address. And some people are saying that a financial transaction tax would do that. The financial transaction tax, I say again, is effectively a tax on trade. It's not a tax on rich bankers. If we want to tax bankers more, then we can do that through the personal taxation system. It's not a tax that is helpful, in my view, to promoting world trade. And I do genuinely believe world trade is the real way that we will help fight poverty around the world.
Ali Khan, the real problem with the tax, the reason actually it's never been introduced in the past is because no country wants to unilaterally impose a tax for fear of placing its own banking sector perhaps at a competitive disadvantage. So do you agree with that train of thought there?
The point you've made is absolutely the point. I mean, nobody is going to stick their neck out on this and unilaterally impose a tax. I mean, it would be suicidal as far as that individual country was concerned. So I think that's the key problem. It's the chicken and the egg situation. You've got everybody to act in concert. It's the Three Musketeers rule. Everyone's got to do it together. It's one for all and all for one. And right now, I don't see anybody thinking that way at all. And I think that's the problem. With going back to the other issue around the fact that they're seeking to tax the transactions, I think, from a mathematical point of view, we have an infinite number of transactions happening a day. And if we could theoretically impose a negligible tax on each of that transaction, less than a single basis point, a tiny fraction, and I think that it is a possible route to do it that way, and it would be barely felt, but the cumulative total would be quite great. And I think that's what the raison d'etre behind it is. But having said all of that, I really think, look, there is political momentum, I can see that, but it's going to be extremely difficult to implement. What we're learning, we might talk the talk about a multipolar world, but really it's everyone on their own pole as far as I can see.
Simon, if this tax were in fact to be implemented, for example, in the City of London, in Canary Wharf, is there a risk that international banks would relocate, and how big a risk is that, do you think?
It's difficult to say what the risk is, but I totally agree with Ali Khan that unless everybody does this together in a harmonised, homogenous way, then banks, hedge funds, other actors in the financial firmament will decide to move their businesses to areas where there is less of this tax. We do have to, if we are going to introduce this, and I don't think we should, think about this on a global basis.
Okay, well, Max, let me bring you in here, and you're listening to what Ali Khan and Simon are saying there. So they're saying for this tax to really work, it has to be implemented on a global basis. So what's the likelihood, or what's the probability, in your opinion, of every country actually adopting this and being able to come on board with this?
I think the first point, it is not true that it would have to be implemented globally. Ideally, it would be implemented globally, but I couldn't agree more that the G20 is not in the position right now to reach a global agreement. So that's the first thing. If we look again at what the IMF has said about financial transaction taxes, it says they're implemented already in one form or other in all the major financial centres, including in the City of London. There are ways and there are clear methods that can be used to implement these taxes in particular time zones, or say, for example, in Europe. So you covered Switzerland, Frankfurt and the City of London, the three major financial centres, and at rates that would mean that it's not economically in the interests of banks to completely close and move to other places. This is a myth that's used to detract from this argument for a tax. We do think a global agreement is the best outcome that we could get, but we're not stupid, we're not politically naive. We think the best way to do this, first of all, is to go where the energy is. The energy is definitely in Europe. You have support for a further tax on the financial sector, not just from the French, but the Spanish, the German government, Chancellor Merkel, the European Commission, and even the UK government saying that it's willing to go further and look at additional taxes on the banks. So that's where the movement is at the moment.
Are you saying that this is largely then a symbolic campaign?
Not at all. I think we can set a precedent by implementing a tax at the European level that would still raise 20, 30 or 40 billion dollars a year. So it's not a small amount. Remember, the vast majority of the world's financial transactions, the kind of casino banking that got us into this financial crisis, happens in London, Frankfurt or New York. So a European tax would capture both London and Frankfurt and raise tens of billions of dollars. So it's not a small move, but it would also be a first step. It sets a really clear precedent. It would demonstrate that it's possible to do this, it's not crazy, it's technically feasible, and it's immensely popular with the public because people really want to see the financial sector pay their fair share. And I think it's really important to see that it is a fair share. Banking and the financial sector is not just another industry, it's the most profitable industry in the world. It's 26 times more profitable than the average industry. It makes twice as much profit each year than oil and gas, for example. This is an industry that was bailed out by the public and is making huge profits and bonuses, and it's generally agreed should and could pay more tax.
Simon, what can banks, or in fact, what have banks really learned from the global economic crisis? We still see multi-billion-dollar salaries being paid out, and pounds, in fact, over in London.
Well, I think what banks have learned from the financial crisis is that they need to do risk management better. They need to hold more capital and more liquidity, and working with regulators, they are already doing that. But alongside this, and for many years, banks have had important corporate and social responsibility programs. So they enable their employees through schemes such as Give As You Earn to pay into charities such as Max's that they nominate, and banks too devote their own resources by where their people power to support charities as well. So I'm in favour of us all encouraging individuals to make charitable commitments. all three of the Abrahamic religions, Islam and Judaism and Christianity, expect their adherents to make charitable contributions. Let's all encourage our fellow citizens to do that.
Ali Khan, is the aim of this tax simply to change the behavior of banks, or is it to encourage, the support of developing nations? What's the real reason behind this, in your opinion?
That's an interesting question. I think clearly from listening to one of your speakers, it's twin-sided. I think, if we're going to encourage better behavior from banks, the transaction tax is going to have a very low correlation with any outcome of that sort. I think if we're trying to help the third world and places like Africa, where I am in, I think far greater help will eventually come from trade. And I think Africa has been on a rising tide of better trade with the rest of the world. So I think your question is quite correct. I don't think this is going to compel any better behavior on the side of the global banking system. I think it's going to be very difficult.
You don't think this will stop speculation, which is...
Speculation is as old as the... No, not at all. I mean, I was reading a book, Lefebvre wrote something in 1923 called Reminiscences of a Stock Market Operator, and in that he said speculation is as old as the hills, and Wall Street never changes. And I think it never will, and we'll continue to see this cycle, boom-bust cycle, because that's the nature of society and the nature of people, and we're extremely greedy, and the greediest of all work for the banks.
Simon, in times of economic downturn, the banks, the bankers and the rich are generally blamed. So in your opinion, is this another case of finger pointing? And we're running out of time, so just if you can briefly answer.
It seems like a bit like that to me. This is not going to stop speculation. Speculation in foreign exchange has always happened, as Ali Khan said. The point is that people on the ground see what's going on within their countries and decide to export their capital using the foreign exchange markets to avoid that economic weakness that they see building up in their own countries. And that's what happened at the end of the 1990s in the Far East, for instance.
Max, over to you now. If you're not successful in Seoul in terms of getting the type of response you want from the G20 leaders, as well as gaining more momentum for this tax that you're trying to push through, what's next? What will you do?
We know the French President, Sarkozy, is committed to pushing for a tax like the financial transaction tax to help development and climate change. We do believe firmly that it would calm the excesses of speculation. I agree that it's not going to cure the problems that have been with us for many years, but serious commentators now feel that a small tax on transactions would reduce what has become an enormous market. It's now 70 times global GDP, the casino that got us into this problem. Remember, we have to turn the casino banks back into utilities. They need to work for the economy, not against it. They need to support trade, and as Oxfam, we completely agree that the answer for Africa isn't just about aid, it's about trade and economic development, but it is about aid and finance too, and they desperately need our help, and this Robin Hood tax could raise that money. We're going to continue fighting through the G20, through the EU and around the world. Those 200 million people have a lot of voice with a lot of politicians, and this is one of those crazy things, a very, very popular tax, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
All right, Max Lawson is Senior Policy Advisor at Oxfam and Robin Hood Tax Campaign spokesman, and Simon Hills, Executive Director at the British Bankers Association from London. Ali Khan Sachu in Nairobi, financial analyst and CEO of Rich Investments. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your thoughts and for joining us on Inside Story. And to our viewers, we welcome your comments and your suggestions as always. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.